Thank you, Amanda. I'm the newest part of the team here, so I guess as part of my hazing, I have to go and speak after these two, which is a great honor, of course. And Bob, you hit the nail on the head. I'm a little bit tired today because I just got back from a walkabout in Australia for 2 weeks. So I'm not sure if you were prescient on that one or you had a little bit of outside knowledge, but yes, do have a bit of the travel bug. So it's a great honor to speak with you all today. I joined Forisk last year as the Director of Forest Operations Research, and talk today a little bit about what's going on the wood side. You've heard a nice story now about what's happening with demands generally, nationally, and in the South in particular. And of course, what happens with the industry at large reflects very closely on what happens with our logging sector, our harvesting and transportation. And as we'll see here in a few moments, wood demand in particular is tied very closely to movements in the employment level and what's happening at the local level with our logging workforce. If those two don't work and move in parallel, then we have all sorts of problems in general with our supply chain. We need our logging capacity to match with our demands in order for everything to operate smoothly. And since we came out of the recession, the change in employment across the South has been a little bit uneven in where those changes have occurred. And a lot of that's played out with the impact of saw timber demand generally across the region. If you look here, this is the change in employment in the logging sector from 2009 to 2014. What you see is that Georgia, in fact, has had a slight decline in employment since 2009, which is a little bit surprising given the trends that you just saw on wood demand. But really what's played out there is that our lowest employment levels occurred in 2012. So we've had 3 years of strong growth in employment in the logging sector, but we're still not up to that employment level that we were at coming out of the recession in 2009, which is a little surprising. But that's because that dip has occurred and we're only just now on the upswing from it. But you look in the Mid-South where Brooks and Amanda have both talked about some of that increased demand for saw timber is a larger portion there, and they're already rebounding faster. They've had a little bit of growth in employment. When we look at what drives employment, as I said, it's very much driven by wood demand. And so this is a little bit complex table, but I want to step through it for you because I think it's quite interesting. There's 4 periods represented here. This is South-wide logging employment. And the first period there is 10 years from 86 to 95, which was the last time that we had any growth, net growth in the logging industry and the number of people employed there. And what you see is that the rate of change, this was annual rate of change in employment, matched up very closely with the change in wood demand. Almost point for point there, 1.78 versus 1.6% change in annual rate of those two. The third column there is the stumpage and delivered price spread. And so what that is basically it's an estimate of what loggers are being paid for their product. It's the delivered price minus the stumpage price. So it's an estimate of how much of that money is going to the logging sector. So it's our estimate of logging rates, essentially. And you can see that closely followed inflation from 86 to 95. They were pretty much matched up perfectly. Logging rates increased at roughly the rate of inflation. The next 10 years, stepping into the big boom of timber, you actually see that we had a decline in logging employment that exceeded the decline in wood demand, a very slight decline in wood demand. But what we also see is that logging rates increased at a slower pace than did inflation. And so basically that employment change was exacerbated by the change in rates, that rates didn't keep pace with inflation. And so stepping into the recession there, that third period that we see, again, employment very closely followed changes in wood demand. And again, rates very closely followed inflation. So those two trends are following in lockstep until we come to this most recent period, which is 2009 to 2014, where we see, as you've heard, wood demand has been increasing strongly coming out of the recession across the South. Rates have actually increased at a faster pace than inflation, which would surprise some folks. But we have seen strong increases in logging rates in real terms. And yet logging employment has not rebounded, as I said, to those levels that we saw going into the recession. We just haven't had that rebound in employment right now. And so what's going on there? It's a little bit different. It's a little bit unexpected given the changes in wood demand. And so part of this is what was driving some of the concerns about logging capacity for a few years that we heard. We haven't heard those complaints quite as loudly recently, at least I haven't. But a lot of what's going on there is news that is good news, actually. Our logging employees are becoming more productive. This is some data that comes out of the University of Georgia. They do a survey of the Georgia logging workforce and the industry every 5 years. It's going to be occurring again next year. So for those of you that have the opportunity to participate, I strongly encourage that. Joe Conrad will be leading that effort. But this is average production for logging employees over a 20-year period. And you can see that it's increasing steadily. So our logging workforce is becoming more and more productive for those folks on the ground. And so this is a great message. It means that we're able to produce more wood with the same number of people. And if you translate that into our employment level, this is the actual number of people employed in the logging sector from 2006 to the end of 2015. You can see we lost a little over 20% of the workforce. And they've been flat for the last couple of years. They're from about 13 to 15. We just haven't seen that big bump. And that's why we say that our current employment levels are below what they were in 2009 coming out of the recession. But if we factor in this gain in productivity, this gain in the ability of our workers to produce wood, effectively, you can look at this as the effective production capacity of that employment. And so effectively, the employment that we have now is able to produce at roughly the level of our employment level in 2007. And so this is why our capacity is actually fairly strong relative to the employment level that we've got right now. And there's another trend that plays into this as well. The recession was very hard on small businesses, and logging businesses as a whole, as you see, lost a large number of people. But those are businesses, and they were very strategic. And we actually saw a little bit of a reallocation of those employees. In 2004, going into the recession, about 44% of logging businesses were composed of folks that were working in the ground, production level employees. About 36% were these administrative and support staff and non-productive employees, and about 19 to 20% was in trucking. Coming out of the recession, 2014, there's a big shift. Now 53% of the folks in the logging industry are production level employees, and only 27% are on that support and administrative side. And so this has some implications to business management, and other people in the business are having to carry some of that capacity. But in terms of productive level, the same number of employees is now 53% of those are on the production side. And so our total logging capacity is actually quite strong relative to what it was in pre-recession levels and those employment levels. So this is sort of why we say that the logging capacity side, the in-wood side, there's not a lot of concern there because we've had this strong growth. They're continuing their productivity, and we've had a little bit of a restructuring of the business. What this does, however, is it puts a strain on the other link in the operations change, which is trucking. So we've had this great story of increasing labor productivity, increasing in-woods productivity. It's much harder to gain that on the trucking side. We've got some limitations legally on how much wood we can put on a truck. And so you can lower the weight of your actual truck and increase a little bit on the payload side. But again, that's limited legally on how far you can go there. Again, hours of operation. This is an issue that's coming up right now, but there's only so many hours you can safely drive and operate those vehicles. And so there's some bounds on just how much we can squeeze out on the trucking side to match these productivity gains. Eventually, we're going to have to add some people, and that's a struggle. That's not to say that there aren't opportunities in the woods. This is some data that we did a study at UGA working with Dale Green and Trip Lowe while I was there. And basically, we had 8 or 9 trucks that we had GPS data on. We tracked these guys for 4 months and just looked at how their production characteristics looked. They averaged around 2.5 loads a day over that 4-month period. And what you see is on days where they got 2 loads, their waiting time in the woods was much, much higher than on the days where they got 3. And so there's some opportunity there. There's chances for us to look at how we perform in the woods and try and shrink some of that waiting time and try and get those extra loads a week and gain a little bit of productivity on the trucking side. But as I say, the best way to increase our trucking capacity is by adding employees. And this is a little bit of foreshadowing, I think, to the talk that'll be tomorrow afternoon talking about some of the labor issues. But there's a real struggle right now in the trucking industry in particular in getting people into that workforce. In 2016, so far, they've had record levels of freight being moved by truck nationally, highest levels we've ever had. And so the demand for truck drivers, just in general, for all types of freight, is higher than it's ever been. If you look at some projections by the American Trucking Association, which is this graph here, they're projecting huge shortages in truck drivers. And so this is for over-the-road freight, overnight type haul characteristics. And so these firms are very large companies. They're the heart of our economy. And so they're throwing a lot of money at this problem. They're offering very competitive benefits packages, very strong salaries, hiring bonuses, all of this to try and get people to come into their industry so that we can continue to meet this demand for freight. That puts a real challenge on our trucking or on our logging firms to maintain sufficient trucking capacity to meet to supply our wood. All right, so we're having some difficulty, and if we can look at some data that shows just how fierce this competition is becoming. So this is data on salaries being paid to different types of truck drivers, depending on the industry that they work for. The middle 4 bars there are for the logging industry. So this is average salary in 2012 through 2015 for various types of truck drivers. And what you see is that in the logging sector, in the last 2 years, we've really been ramping up how much we're having to pay our truck drivers to keep them in the industry and to try and recruit other folks. Right now, we are competing fairly closely with what oil and gas is paying for their truck drivers. So from an industry standpoint, we are one of the most competitive industries to try and get and recruit more people into the trucking side. So it is a fierce competition. There's no question about it. And I don't see that this is going to change anytime in the future. There's going to have to be more money flowing to folks to get them, to encourage them to come and deliver in the woods. This next graph is a little bit busy, and I apologize about that, but it's basically the national picture. So there's 4 regions depicted here. In the upper left corner is the South, very similar to the graph I just showed you. In all 4 of these graphs, logging is the middle industry. But there's 5 industries represented here. In the South, the West is the sort of the top right. The Northeast is the bottom left, and the Lake States is the bottom right. And what you see is that in the South and in the West, the logging sector, which is again those middle 4 bars, has had increasing rates for their logging truck drivers, and they are the most competitive industry of those 4 compared, which are all local truck drivers. These are not over-the-road industries that we're comparing against. They're all local industries. So competing for the exact same pool of labor of the folks that would be interested in coming home at night and doing their local deliveries. So in the South and the West, we are the most competitive on some of the salaries that are being offered. You look at the Northeast and the Lake States, it's very different. They're one of the least competitive, and that sort of meshes with some of the message that we heard earlier from Brooks and Amanda. Those regions are not as competitive generally in the wood industry, and so they're not having to put as much money, and they're not feeling as much pressure to maintain or to grow that trucking capacity. The other side of the coin in total compensation is the benefits. So this was salaries. Now we also want to look at the other part of it, which is the benefits they can get in that compensation package. And so this is some preliminary data that we've collected at Forisk as part of a Wood Supply Research Institute funded study. A lot of you in the room have helped us with this, and so I thank you for that. But we basically surveyed a number of logging contractors around the country and asked them, what sort of benefits are you offering to your employees? And so the data that's in here is specifically to the southern respondents to that survey. What you see is that about a quarter of our logging contractors in the South offer some sort of access to a retirement plan. Less than half offer access to health insurance. About 3/4 offer some sort of paid leave, whether that's vacation or holidays. Any of those sorts of things would count as paid leave in some form. About 60% offer some sort of production bonus to their employees. If you compare that against the trucking industry in general, that's the other column there, and you can see that almost all trucking firms offer access to a retirement plan, health insurance, and paid leave. About 60%, roughly the same level, offer some sort of incentive pay. The difference is that incentive is typically a bonus tied to how much time they have to wait. If those truckers are delivering some product and they have to wait more than an hour anywhere, they're not able to drive, that's the bonus. They get paid for time where they're not actually able to move. And so those incentives are very much tied to situations where they're not able to keep moving that product and keep earning loaded miles. The other thing you'll notice there is the signing bonus. About half of these firms are offering a signing bonus of $1,000 to $2,000 for anyone that qualifies and can come and join those companies. So very competitive right now on the trucking side to try and get some of this industry some capital on the labor side. Just by comparison, wanted to throw this up to show you this is what's been happening with our basically in-woods equipment operators. The trend is salaries here. The blue line is logging, and you can see that the salaries have been increasing, but pretty much commensurate with what other industries are doing. The one I'll point out there is the orange line, which is basically excavator, construction level equipment operators. Those folks typically are going to be a little bit more urban on average, and so they do get a little bit of a premium on the salary, but we're very much competitive with our in-woods operator salaries versus some of these other competing industries. The black line there is basically farm equipment, and so you can see that we're much more competitive on a salary basis than those. So just to give you a little bit of flavor there of how the competition is going to try and grow and maintain our capacity. The other struggles that we face are, of course, not just on the cost side, but we're going to start to see folks continue to leave the industry. This is a graph of the average age of all people employed in logging, essentially, the green bar there, or the green line. And you can see the trend is increasing. The orange is the actual median age of the entire labor force of the U.S. And so our loggers are aging at a much faster rate than is the labor force, the average labor force of the U.S. The other discouraging part of this trend is that during the recession, you see that median age really spiked up. And so it means that the young folks that were in the industry were the first ones that got chased out, which is discouraging. It's nice to see that coming out of the recession, we have seen some younger folks coming into the logging side and bringing that average age back down, but it really just came back down to the long-term trend. Still, in general, the average age of our logging workforce is increasing at a much faster pace than the average labor force of the U.S., which is a discouraging trend long-term. The other sort of headwind is that the folks that live in rural parts of the country are declining as well. So this is Georgia's non-metropolitan, basically, labor force, the population of the folks that are of working age that live in non-metropolitan areas. And since 2010, we've seen a decline of between 7 and 8% in that portion of the labor force as well. And so the pool of candidates to work in this industry, or in the logging sector, is declining as well. And so there's some real headwinds, some real challenges there that we face. One opportunity probably for continued growth would be to consider some of the non-traditional folks that have not been in our industry in a large percentage. And so the Hispanic workforce has been a somewhat growing sector in logging. You can see during the recession that the Hispanic folks were some of the folks that got forced out of the industry as well, but has been starting to come back. And I think that we'll continue to see that. If you go over into the Mid-South in particular, you see a fairly large proportion of that industry is coming from Hispanic workers. And I think that we'll continue to see growth in that area. That has some implications for training and safety. Equipment operators need to have some materials available to them that might speak to them more clearly in Spanish. That's something that we probably need to address at some level if we're going to continue to recruit folks in here, because we do want to maintain our stellar safety record in the South, because otherwise the insurance rates will begin to eat us up. So just wanted to wrap up with that. Basically, you've heard the trends on wood demand are very positive nationally and locally in the South, in Georgia. Our loggers have shifted their structure during the recession. They're very productive. They're as productive as they've ever been. We hope to find out in a year or so that trend has been continuing for the last 5 years. Really, it's trucking capacity where the concern is competition for those truckers and finding new labor pools to resupply our logging industry. With that, I will wrap it up and we'll open up the questions.
Let's give everybody a round of applause before we do the questions. Thanks to all of our speakers this morning. A lot of great information. There are mics in this aisle here and this one over here. Some of you don't need them because you're a loud mouse to start with, but if you have a question you'd like to pose it, please go to the mic. So we're open for business. We've got plenty of time before lunch. So if you have questions of the panelists, please let's hear them.